Previously, on One Last Kiss, Eleanor awoke the next morning after reading Richard's journal. She read about the night that Richard drank human blood for the first time. She felt she could sympathize with his loneliness and thought of how she wished she could have been there to comfort him. If she didn't know any better, she would think she was beginning to fall in love with Richard. Later that evening, Eleanor and her father awaited Trevor's arrival for dinner. When Eleanor answered the door to let Trevor in, she stared at him to get a better look than she had before. She was struck by his beauty. She finally snapped out of her gaze and led him into their home. While they ate, Eleanor asked Trevor about Richard's journal. She wanted to know about his thoughts on the journal and the story inside. Trevor assures her that the story is very real. With having a relative in his family with such an interesting history, he felt the need to prove the story was true. As they continue to eat, Eleanor's father begins to question Trevor about vampires. He wants to know how to spot a vampire when he sees one. Trevor tells him that the vampires look like any other person on the streets. He tells him again that he is better off fleeing from the vampires rather than fighting them. Eleanor's father didn't like Trevor's answer and starts to become angry. He asked him one last time to help him kill the vampires, and again, Trevor refuses to help. At which point, Eleanor's father jumps up from his table and yells at Trevor and tells him to get out of his house. As Trevor gets up to leave, he tells Eleanor that she is in danger if she cannot convince her father to leave Shadow Glen. Eleanor tries to calm her father down and reason with him, but he just tells her to go to her room. Instead, Eleanor grabs her cloak and runs out of the house after Trevor. As she runs into the night, Eleanor begins to feel uneasy. She has never been outside at night before. She finally stops running and looks around. The fog that rolled in from the river made everything look different and difficult to see. Eleanor believes that she has missed Richard and lost track of him. She decides she needs to get back home, but she is unable to tell which direction she came from. Just then, she sees a dark figure coming towards her. Before she has a chance to react, she realizes that it's Trevor. He asks her what she's doing outside at night and reminds her that it's not safe for her to be out. He tells Eleanor that he will walk her back home safely. On their way back, Eleanor tries to pry some answers out of Trevor. She asks him why he keeps warning her to leave and asks how he knows that she is in danger. He tells her that he cannot tell her why, though he wishes he could. Eleanor then asks Trevor how he is related to Richard. He only tells her that he is a distant relative. He then tells her that he despised what Richard had become. Eleanor finally mentions to him that she had received an invitation to Priscilla's ball. Trevor says that Priscilla had not mentioned to him that she had invited Eleanor. When they got back to her house, Trevor leaned in and kissed Eleanor. He apologizes to her, then quickly leaves. Just as Eleanor is about to enter her house, she hears a blood-curdling scream coming from within the house. She runs inside to find her father lying on the floor of his study. He has a wooden stake sticking out of his chest. She grabs the stake and pulls it free. Then, Eleanor grabs his hand as he slowly bleeds out and tells him that she loves him and asks him who did this. With his last dying breath, he calls out Trevor's name. Eleanor doesn't know what to think. Why did he say Trevor's name? Was he her father's murderer? Or was he trying to tell her that Trevor is the only one she can trust? Just then, she hears the door closing behind her, and she turns around to find Trevor entering the room. She immediately begins accusing him of killing her father. Trevor denies the accusation. He claims that he heard the scream and came to make sure Eleanor was all right. She doesn't believe him and lunges at Trevor with the stake that came from her father's chest, but he easily dodges her attack and grabs her from behind. He tells her that it was the vampires that killed her father. Eleanor still claims that she doesn't believe in vampires, but if they are real, she will gladly risk death to avenge her father's death. Trevor tells her that she is better off fleeing from the vampires, just as he told her father. He warns her that they might even try to change her into a creature of the night as well. He asks her if she has anyone she can stay with. He even offers to pay her passage to anywhere she wants to go. But Eleanor tells him that she has nowhere to go and no one she can turn to. And again, she says that she will not leave until she gets her revenge against the vampires. Trevor then tells her that she cannot stay. He tells her that the vampires killed her father so they could get to her more easily. She is no longer safe in Shadow Glen. Eventually, Trevor leads Eleanor to her room and tells her to get some sleep. Then he stands guard outside her room until the sun comes up. When she awoke the next morning, she found that Trevor had taken her father's body away and cleaned up the blood. Then she hears a knock at the door. She answers it to find the town reverend. He tells her that her father's body was brought to him last night and that arrangements were made for her father's funeral later that afternoon. Eleanor was surprised to find out that Trevor had done all of this for her. Eventually, Eleanor left her house to try and get her mind off of things. She went to Mr. Dobbins' house to see her friend Annie and tell her the terrible news about her father. Later that afternoon, Eleanor attended her father's funeral. Annie was the only other person that showed up for the service. When her father was being lowered into the grave, the coffin slipped and fell. Eleanor saw the casket come open and watched her father begin to rise up. He reached out for Eleanor and bared his pointed white fangs. She tried to step back from her father, but the loose earth beneath her feet caused her to slip into the grave. Annie cried out for her as she fell. Suddenly, Eleanor opened her eyes and saw that the coffin had never opened. Her father was still nailed inside. She had imagined the whole thing. The Reverend helped her out of the grave. Then Annie asked her what happened. Eleanor only told her that she had fallen. She didn't want to tell anyone what she thought she had seen. Later that evening, Eleanor had finally returned home. She was stricken with grief as she walked into her father's study. She noticed a small ribbon hanging out of one of the drawers in the desk. Eleanor pulled out the ribbon and recognized it right away. It was the ribbon from her first bonnet when she was a little girl. She pulled open the drawer and found a cloth doll that her father had given to her. It was a meaningful gift from her father. Eleanor began to cry at the collected memories her father held on to. As she sat in the study, she began to hear a faint noise coming from outside. Then Eleanor remembered she had forgotten to lock the door. She then hears the door open and soft footsteps entering her home. She grabbed a poker from the fire and held it above her head, waiting for the intruder to enter the room. When the figure stepped into the room, Eleanor froze and released the poker from her hold. She stared as the soft voice called out to her. "Eleanor Rollins, I have been searching for you." Chapter 12. Stunned, Eleanor stared at the woman who stood in her father's study. She was the most beautiful woman Eleanor had ever seen. She wore a bright red gown that shimmered as she glided farther into the room. Her blonde hair was swept on top of her head and held in place with combs studded with diamonds and rubies. Her blue eyes sparkled. Eleanor heard her blood thrumming at her temples, felt her pulse jump at her throat. She watched the woman set a wicker basket on the desk. The woman angled her head slightly. "You are Eleanor Rollins, aren't you?" Eleanor nodded jerkily. The woman's smile grew. "I am Priscilla Fear." Eleanor's eyes widened. "Trevor's cousin?" "Yes." The woman's smile faded. "Trevor told me the tragic news of your father's death. I brought you some food. You shouldn't have to cook at a time like this." Eleanor looked at the large basket. It was filled with bread, cheeses, and preserves. The act of kindness from a stranger touched her deeply. Tears flooded her eyes, and she pressed her fingers to her lips, releasing a tiny sob. Priscilla hurried around the desk and wrapped her arm around Eleanor and led her to the sofa. "Oh, my dear, I did not mean to upset you," she said. Eleanor sank onto the sofa. "Only Annie came to the funeral," she murmured in a voice thick with grief. "Trevor wanted to attend," Priscilla assured her, "but an emergency arose, and he was needed elsewhere." Eleanor wiped the tears from her cheeks and met Priscilla's haunting blue gaze. "He did?" Priscilla smiled warmly. "He is very fond of you. He speaks of you often." Eleanor felt her face flush. "I like him," she confessed. "I'm so happy to hear that," Priscilla said. "Trevor is really very lonely. I am glad he has you for a friend." Eleanor felt her cheeks burning. Priscilla laughed lightly. "I'm sorry. I've embarrassed you." "A little," Eleanor admitted. She sighed deeply. "But I feel so lost. With my father gone, I'm all alone and frightened. I don't know what to do." "You must move away from the memories. Leave this house. Have you other family somewhere?" Priscilla asked. Eleanor shook her head. "My mother died when I was a baby. Father was all the family I had." "What about friends?" Priscilla asked. "Only Annie, and she's an indentured servant. She can't help me." "How much money do you have? Enough to live on?" Eleanor was startled by the personal nature of the question, but she knew the deep crimson flush on her cheeks revealed the answer. No, she whispered. "I have practically nothing. I don't even own the farm." Priscilla squeezed her hand. "Then, my dear, there is only one solution for this unfortunate circumstance." "And what is that?" Eleanor asked. "You must move to Fear Manor." Chapter 13. Eleanor stared at Priscilla Fear in surprise. She could not believe that she had heard her correctly. Move to Fear Manor? Live with Trevor and Priscilla? "I couldn't," Eleanor protested. "Why ever not?" Eleanor thought of her father naming Trevor as his murderer. "I don't want to impose." "That's not possible." Priscilla rose gracefully to her feet. "Trevor would do anything for you, Eleanor. I'm surprised he didn't make the suggestion himself, and it's not proper or safe for a young woman like you to be living alone." Eleanor began. "You certainly didn't intend to stay in this lonely old house on your own, did you?" Eleanor shuddered at the thought. Despite all her good memories of this house, now it would always remind her of her father's death. "Of course not," Priscilla went on. "Then it's settled. You'll come stay with us, at least until you've made time to decide what you want to do. Now, go pack a few things. My driver is waiting in the carriage outside. You shall move in with us tonight." Eleanor drew her cloak around her as the open carriage rumbled over the road toward Fear Manor. At her feet sat her bag with her clothes, her hairbrush, the doll she'd found in her father's desk, and Richard Fear's journal. She had no idea what the future would hold, what she would do, where she would go, but now she felt safe, safer than she had felt in a long, long time. Priscilla sat beside her, her hands stuffed inside a fur muff. "I love the night," Priscilla murmured. Eleanor could see why. The clear black winter sky was lit with stars, like thousands of tiny diamonds. She had not known that the night could be so beautiful. "I was always taught to fear the night," Eleanor admitted. "That is no longer necessary," Priscilla said softly. The idea was a novel one to Eleanor. Could it possibly be true, she wondered? Would she ever be able to walk beneath the night sky and feel safe? Her stomach gave a sudden lurch when the house came into view. The massive stone structure was 3 stories high. Silhouetted against the bright orange moon was a gate made of black iron spires. The place looked forbidding, half fortress, half prison. The carriage rocked to a stop. The young driver jumped down and helped Priscilla from the carriage. "Please carry Miss Eleanor's bag to her room, Ben," Priscilla said. "Yes, ma'am," he replied curtly before helping Eleanor down as well. She saw him heft her bag out of the carriage. He opened the gate, then followed behind them. Priscilla led the way up to the stone steps. The door creaked open. A thin, hunched servant opened the door wider. "Miss Priscilla, you are home early," he said. He took her cloak when she stepped into the foyer. Awed by the magnificence of the entryway, Eleanor stood like a wooden statue. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling. It looked as though 100 candles flickered within the delicate glass. She heard Priscilla's voice echo through the grand hall. "Winslow, this is Miss Eleanor Rollins. She will be staying with us in the guest room." Eleanor turned her head in time to see an elderly servant lift a brow. "Does the master know?" "He will know by morning," Priscilla said. She handed Winslow her muff. "I will tell him myself." "Is Trevor here now?" Eleanor asked. "Mr. Fear is out for the evening," Winslow replied stiffly. Priscilla squeezed her hand. "Let me show you your room." Eleanor followed Priscilla up a wide, sweeping staircase. Their footsteps echoed off the stone. Eleanor shivered. The house was incredibly cold. "You will be warmer in your room," Priscilla assured her. At the top of the stairs, Eleanor saw the carriage driver coming out of a room. "I put Miss Eleanor's bags in one of the guest rooms," he told Priscilla. "Thank you, Ben," Priscilla replied. "You may put the carriage away. I won't be going out tonight." "Very good, miss." Eleanor felt as though she were in a dream. She could barely believe that she was in this huge, elaborate mansion, that a servant had just carried her bag to her room. She had heard the rumors that the Fears were wealthy, but she hadn't realized they lived such a life of comfort. "This way," Priscilla said, taking her hand and leading her into the guest bedroom. Eleanor's mouth dropped open and her eyes widened. The room was as large as the entire second floor of her father's house. Candles flickered from the crystal chandelier in the center of the room. A thick oriental carpet covered the floor. A sofa covered in ivory silk brocade sat before the massive hearth, where a fire burned brightly. The same rich ivy silk formed the canopy of the bed. Eleanor crossed the room and touched the fine, polished wood of the vanity. A plush chair sat in front of it. An intricately carved hairbrush and a golden comb were set on a lace doily on the vanity. There were powders in tins and perfumes in tiny crystal bottles, more than she could use in a lifetime. And yet, what had brought her here was her father's death. Priscilla stood in the doorway, smiling. "Make yourself at home, Eleanor. Consider anything in this room yours." I don't know what to say," Eleanor stammered. Priscilla raised a brow. "Thank you?" Eleanor shook her head. "That doesn't seem like enough." "It's more than enough," Priscilla assured her. "You must be tired. Sleep well, and I'll see you tomorrow." The door clicked softly, and Priscilla disappeared. Eleanor changed into her nightgown. Gingerly, she stretched out on the bed. Her body sank into a heavenly goose-down mattress. Never in her life had she felt such a soft bed. Her own mattress at home was stuffed with coarse horsehair that settled into stiff lumps. She closed her eyes. She would be safe here. She felt it deep within her. She would be safe here with Trevor and Priscilla. Eleanor awoke from a deep sleep. She rolled over and arched her back, stretching her arms and legs. She couldn't remember the last time she had slept so soundly. She rolled out of bed and walked to the window. She drew the heavy draperies aside and squinted as bright shafts of sunlight streamed into the room. She stumbled back. It must be afternoon, she realized. I slept through half the day. Hurriedly, she dressed and dashed down the stairs. Winslow stood in the hallway. He was dusting a side table. Eleanor came to an abrupt halt. "Hello, Winslow." He tipped his head slightly. "Miss Eleanor, I trust you slept well." "Yes, too well and too late. I don't usually sleep so long," she confessed. She felt uncomfortable with his gaze boring into her. "Is Mr. Fear home?" "Yes, miss." The servant glanced quickly at the closed door across the hall. "He is in his study, working on his books. He left strict orders that he was not to be disturbed." "Does he know I'm here?" she asked. "Yes, miss. Miss Priscilla told him last night." Eleanor shivered at the frigid edge in his voice. Winslow made it sound as though Trevor were not pleased with the news. "I really must speak with him," she insisted. "It's very important." "That's not possible. Mr. Fear insists that he be left alone during the day. He leaves his study near dusk. You may visit with him then." "What about Miss Priscilla? Is she here?" Eleanor asked. "She has gone out for the day. I was instructed to bring your meals to your room. If you will return to your room, miss, I shall serve you your breakfast." Winslow's tone left no possibility for argument. Eleanor returned to her room. Moments later there was a knock on the door. She opened it to find Winslow holding a covered silver tray. "Your breakfast, miss," he said. The silver tray held eggs, bacon, biscuits, and a steaming mug of coffee. Eleanor nibbled at the meal. Her mind was racing with questions. Was Trevor upset because she was staying in his house? Was his work so important that she couldn't disturb him, if only for a moment? "I suppose I ought to be patient," she told herself. She sighed and once again picked up Richard Fear's journal. Wickham Village, Massachusetts Colony, 1627. Blood. My need for blood grows. Chapter 14. Wickham Village, Massachusetts Colony, 1627. Blood. My need for blood grows. I have no control over this constant craving, this constant need. It is as much a part of me as my thoughts. The colony of vampires continues to increase. Gwendolyn carefully selects those she will bring into the order. Already, she has over a dozen who gather at her call. I see the other vampires, surrounding me, watching me, their eyes flickering red beneath the moon. When I look at them, I see what I am, and I cannot bear what I see. Tonight, I stalked through the woods, alone, always alone. My body hungered for blood. My stomach ached with the need to feed. My mouth was parched, and I knew no amount of water would quench my thirst. Only blood would satisfy me. Warm, rich blood, bright red and fresh, flowing from the body of my victim. I heard the rustle of dry leaves and twigs. I halted and crouched low, waiting for my prey. I could smell the blood that pulsed just below the surface of its flesh. I saw my prey scurry in front of me. With lightning speed, I snatched up the wood rat. I heard its hysterical squeal just before I dug my fangs into its furry throat. The animal kicked and struggled as I drank its precious blood. Then it went limp. I tossed it aside and wiped the back of my hand across my mouth. My hunger was sated, but the meal sickened me. I threw back my head and roared out my anger and my grief. I need blood to survive, yet I cannot bring myself to kill a human for it. So I doom myself to seeking out the lowliest creatures, animals whose scent and taste disgust me. I heard taunting laughter echo around me. Gwendolyn stood behind me, as beautiful as ever, but dangling between her fingers was the dead wood rat I discarded. "Oh, Richard, you must stop being so noble," she said. "It makes me ill to think of you sucking on this poor creature." "You know I cannot take human blood," I told her. "But it is so much richer, so much sweeter. Human blood will give you strength and power, unlike anything you can imagine. She will never understand that I do not want strength or power. I only want to be what I once was, a simple man. But nothing can give that back to me." Beyond her shoulder I saw the sky begin to lighten, blacken to gray, and I knew it was not long before dawn. I shoved my way past Gwendolyn, headed for the nearby graveyard. There, I wove my way among the many headstones and markers. I pulled aside the stone covering of a crypt and slipped inside. A stairway led beneath the ground to a family vault. Gwendolyn followed me. "Richard, you cannot stay angry forever," she said. "It has been years since you became a vampire." "I shall stay angry until the day I die." "I have given you immortality, and all you do is complain. If you are so desperate to stop being a vampire, then step into the sunlight," she taunted. She had yet to close the door to the crypt. A sliver of sun eased through the portal. I stared at it. I knew the legends. The sun would bring me death. "Go ahead, end your misery," she said with a sneer. Slowly, I walked toward the sunlight. I squinted against the brightness of the sun. I thrust my hand into the piercing shaft of sunlight. The pain was immediate and intense. Agony. I watched in horror as my skin blistered and burst open. I released an agonized wail and drew back my hand. I heard laughter echo inside the tomb. Gwendolyn gave me a triumphant smile. "Imagine your whole body feeling that pain. I think you are too much of a coward for such a death," she whispered. "Richard Fear, I think you will stay a vampire. Forever." I awoke. The day had passed. I felt it deep within my bones. Strange how I always knew when night arrived. A stone coffin served as my bed. I shoved the lid aside. Its scraping sound echoed through my crypt. My hand still burned. I was a fool to think I could accept death so easily. The truth remained. Much as I hate being a vampire, I still want to live. But I want to spare others from my fate. As long as Gwendolyn lived, other humans would become her victims. I knew I would make bitter enemies if I destroyed her, but I was willing to risk it. I climbed out of my coffin. Quietly, I crossed the room and eased the lid of her coffin aside. She slept deeply. I wondered if she dreamed. Her eyes remained closed. She always slept a little longer than I did. I crept from the crypt and went in search of a weapon. I found a sturdy limb. Using the knife I carried at my side, I sharpened the end until it became a chiseled point. When I completed my task, I made my way back to the crypt. Moonlight streamed in through the doorway. I shoved the lid to her coffin farther aside. Pale Gwendolyn opened her eyes. She smiled at me and licked her lips. "Richard, I am starving. Will you share the blood of a man with me tonight?" she asked in a throaty voice. "No," I cried as I plunged the stake deep within her heart. Her chest closed around the wooden stake. She released a blood-curdling cry. She wrapped her hands around the stake. Dark crimson blood stained her chest. She trembled, shook, convulsed. I stared in muted horror. What had I done? I expected her to die, quickly. Her tormented screams echoed through the crypt and rang within my ears. The blood soaked her gown. So much blood. Her body arched, and then she fell back, still and silent. I stared at her face, frozen in a moment of torment, her mouth agape, her eyes bulging. I had thought nothing was worse than being a vampire. I was wrong. Now, I am a murderer. Chapter 15. Eleanor shut Richard's journal and set it on the table. The entry she had just read sickened her, and yet she still felt sorry for Richard. He had never wanted to be a vampire or a murderer, and yet he had become both. No wonder Trevor despised him. Trevor. Eleanor's attention returned to the present. She had to talk to Trevor. Perhaps he would see her now. She walked soundlessly down the stairs. She could see no sign of Winslow. Eleanor crept towards Trevor's study. Holding her breath, she turned the doorknob. It clicked. She froze and glanced over her shoulder. Still no sign of Winslow. She slipped into Trevor's study. A coldness wrapped around her. She shuddered. The study was still and dark. Trevor was not anywhere in the room. The desk had no paper scattered over it. The hearth had no fire burning within it. How strange, she thought. Why wouldn't Trevor warm the room while he was working in here? And where did he go? Winslow thought he was in here, but obviously he isn't. She walked to the windows, drew the heavy draperies back, and peered outside. Bare branches twisted in the wind. It was too cold for anyone to take a walk outside. She turned her attention back to the room. Perhaps Trevor went to take a nap, she thought, remembering how he'd protected her through the night. She could not blame him if he was tired. She decided it was best to wait for him here. If Trevor had plans to work on his ledgers, he would return soon. Eleanor began to wander the room. Floor-to-ceiling shelves lined the walls. Every shelf contained books, volumes and volumes of books. Many of the titles were in Latin or French, and many of the books were old, their leather bindings cracked, their pages yellow with age. Where did Trevor get such an enormous collection, she wondered? Had he inherited it, or had he collected the books himself? An extremely weathered volume caught her attention. Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. Eleanor had heard of the medieval story, but had never seen a copy of it. She tried to remove it from the shelf, but it stayed in place. It's wedged tightly between these other books, she realized. She tried to push the other books aside, but they wouldn't budge. She tightened her hold on the book and jerked it back. Click. The faint sound caught her attention. She stared as the shelves swung slightly apart, creating a tiny crevice between the shelves. A hidden entrance. What had Trevor hidden behind these shelves? Eleanor pulled the wall of shelves farther back and ducked into the darkened space. She couldn't see anything, just the darkness surrounding her. She slipped back into the study, lit a candle, and returned to the hidden door. The soft glow from the candle revealed a dark hallway ahead of her. She couldn't see its ending, only a black cavernous space that resembled a huge gaping mouth. Taking a deep breath, Eleanor began to follow the narrow, dank passage. She could smell the scent of damp earth and something else, something foul and odorous, like rotting flesh. Green slime covered the walls. The floor was slick with a similar coating. The farther she walked, the colder it became. This is a tunnel, she realized, leading underground. The candle's flame flickered wildly. An archway came into view. Beneath it, a thick wooden door stood slightly ajar. Eleanor pushed the door all the way open. She stepped inside. She lifted the candle higher. The room was small and empty, except for the coffin that sat in the middle of the room. Eleanor swallowed hard. Why would a coffin be here, she wondered. She placed her hand on the rough wooden pine lid of the casket. The wood was stained with age. How long had it been in this room? With icy dread skittering along her spine, she lifted the lid. She held the candle higher. She could make out a figure lying in the box, clothed in black, still, unmoving, like a corpse. She saw the pale, slender hands, the fingers intertwined across the chest. The white shirt beneath the black cloak made a stark contrast against the darkness. She moved the candle farther along the coffin. She saw the broad shoulders. The pale light from the candle licked at the man's chin. Fear clenched her stomach. She moved the candle until the light illuminated the face. "No," she gasped. It was Trevor's face. Pale, incredibly pale, and still as death. Reaching out with trembling fingers, Eleanor touched his cheek. Bitter cold greeted her. His skin had no trace of warmth. She felt as though her heart were breaking. He was dead. Someone had killed him and hidden him here. "Oh, Trevor," she whispered on a shaky breath. "What did they do to you?" His eyes flew open and focused on her. He opened his mouth and bared glistening white pointed fangs. Eleanor screeched and stumbled back. She stared in horror as he lifted himself out of the coffin. His eyes glowed red in the darkened crypt. The truth hit Eleanor hard. Anger surged through her at his betrayal. "You're a vampire," she said. "You're just like Richard Fear." "No, Eleanor," he snarled. "I am Richard Fear." Chapter 16. "No," Eleanor said. "You can't be Richard Fear." It was impossible. Richard and Trevor could not be the same. So who was the monster who was slowly advancing on her, his eyes burning like red flames? She turned quickly back toward the passage that led to the study. Her movement created a draft, a small gust of wind. The flame on her candle fluttered and died. Darkness descended and enveloped her like a black cloak. Confused and disoriented, Eleanor froze. Where was the entrance? Where was Richard Fear? She took a tiny step back. The hairs on the back of her neck prickled. She felt a slight breeze, like the cold breath of death, blow across her face. Frantically, she slapped at the air. Her fingers grazed a face, a cold, hard face. She staggered back. Her shoulder slammed against the wall. The wall. If she could just follow it. Pressing her back to the wall, holding her breath, she cautiously moved through the darkness. The silence was deafening. Why didn't he speak? Why couldn't she hear him move, or see the red light of his eyes? Please let the doorway be nearby, she thought frantically. If she could just find it, she could run. "Eleanor," his raspy voice echoed around her. "Leave me alone," she cried. She heard a rush of movement, then she felt a body pressing against her, pinning her to the wall. Let me go!" she yelled. She hit and clawed at him, but he didn't move away. And now, even in the darkness, she saw the glow of his eyes. Red, like blood-red rubies. "A vampire's eyes are hypnotic," he said, his voice low. "Or so legend says." A bead of sheer dread slid down her spine as he traced his finger along her throat. "A vampire has no trouble hypnotizing his prey," he explained. "I need only gaze into your eyes, and you shall do exactly as I will. You shall be incapable of anything else." Eleanor shut her eyes. She would not let him hypnotize her. Richard continued talking in a silky voice. "Next, the vampire sinks his fangs into his victim's throat, so that he can feed on her blood." Her eyes flew open as she felt his lips pressed against her neck in a kiss. "Slowly, deliciously," Richard went on. "The blood pulses into the vampire's mouth, giving him strength and sustenance, allowing him to live forever." Eleanor felt the points of his teeth skim across the flesh at her throat. "He's going to sink his fangs into my neck," she realized. Her body went rigid with panic. She struggled against him, but his hold was too tight. Eleanor felt as though she were encased in a cocoon, suffocating, dying. Richard pressed his thumb against the pulse at her throat. "You have such a strong heart. I feel it beating. Your blood will pour forth, filling me quickly." She felt the prick of his teeth pressing against her neck. "Tell me, Eleanor," he whispered. "Do you want to become what I am?" Chapter 17. "No!" Eleanor cried. She shoved against Richard with all her strength. She felt his hard chest beneath her hands and pushed harder. She struggled, trying to break free of his grip, but it was useless. It was as if she were bound in steel. His fingers relaxed their hold on her shoulders. Then she was pushing at air as he moved away. "I did not think you would want to be a vampire," he replied quietly. She heard the strike of flint, and suddenly the flame of the candle flared to life. She saw Richard, Trevor, standing before her, somber. "I won't hurt you," he told her. Violent trembling shook Eleanor's body. She wanted to run, but the sadness within his eyes held her captive. "Why did you attack me?" she asked. "I wasn't attacking you. You panicked. I was trying to stop you from hurting yourself." He sighed. "And in a strange sort of way, I wanted to prove to you that I could hurt you, but that I never would." She felt tears sting her eyes as she rubbed her throat. "Who are you? Trevor or Richard?" "Both. Over 100 years ago, my mother named me Richard. I have changed my name several times since. It makes it easier to disappear when people discover what I am. The journal I read is mine," he admitted with defeat echoing in his voice. You lied to me," she said in a shaky voice. "You told me all the reasons that you believe vampires exist, all the reasons except the most important one, that you are one of them. Why did you not tell me?" He laughed harshly. "Look at me, Eleanor. Really look at me. I have not seen the sunlight in almost a century. Did you not feel the chill of my flesh when you touched me?" She shuddered with the memory. His lips were as cold as an icy river. His pale face framed his dark eyes. "What should I call you?" she asked. "A freak," he answered. He slammed the lid down on the coffin. "A vampire. A beast of the night." "No." She rushed across the room and grabbed his hand. He glared at her, his breathing harsh, pain filling his eyes. "You are not a freak. I read your journal. I know you did not want this. I just wanted to know what name I should call you. Trevor or Richard?" "Call me Trevor. Everyone else does," he admitted. "Does anyone else know you're a vampire?" she asked hesitantly. "You are the only human who knows about me," he confessed. "The only human? Are there other vampires?" she asked, dreading the answer. "Yes, there are colonies of vampires here, and on the continent as well. My kind lives in caves, dungeons, cellars, crypts, wherever the sun cannot go." "Do you think one of the other vampires killed my father?" she asked. He nodded slowly. "I am certain of it." Eleanor pictured her father's body, the stake through his heart. It had been a cruel and painful death. She could not let it go unavenged. "Then I must find his murderer," she said slowly, "and I must take on my father's quest to find those who murdered my mother." "Eleanor, Trevor's voice deepened with anger. "Forget this ridiculous quest." "It is not ridiculous," she retorted. "I think my father discovered who murdered my mother. I think the murderer found out and killed my father." Trevor shook his head. "You don't know that." "I know my father is dead, and I know that I will not rest until those who killed him are punished," she said. With a low growl, Trevor lunged at her. Eleanor darted back, but could not evade him. He grabbed her shoulders and shook her. His eyes were filled with the fire of anger. "You will be like a field mouse avenging itself on a tiger," he said. "Do you not see that even the weakest vampire has the strength of 10 mortal men? Can you not understand? A vampire has not only the power to kill you, but to turn you into the living dead." Eleanor stared at Trevor, stunned by his fury. Have you ever turned anyone into a vampire?" She feared the answer, but needed to know the truth. "No," he said, "but I find myself thinking too often of sinking my teeth into your throat, so I will not have to watch you grow old, so I can love you forever." "Do you love me?" she whispered. "Yes." A shadow of a smile touched his lips. "I cannot seem to make myself stop thinking about you. That is why I tried to warn you away. Your greatest danger may come from me." He leaned forward and kissed her tenderly. Eleanor's mind whirled with confusion. Could I possibly be falling in love with him? She wondered. Even knowing what I do? Yes, she realized. I could. She broke away from the kiss. "If you love me, you must tell me once and for all. Did you kill my father?" "No." Trevor took her hand in his. "I swear by my love for you that I did not kill him or your mother." Eleanor's heart thudded painfully within her chest. "I believe you," she said. "I am glad," Trevor replied. He looked around them with a weary smile. "What a place to declare love, a crypt. Come, let us at least return to the house." He led her along the passageway back to his study. As he neared the hidden door, he asked, "Did you close the door to my study?" "Yes," she told him. "Good. My servants do not know they work for a vampire," he told her. "I fear they would not remain if they knew the truth." Quietly, he pushed open the door of the study. Eleanor slipped through the opening, with Trevor behind her. He clicked the door back into place. Trevor set the candle on the desk and crossed the room. He drew the heavy draperies aside. Outside, night had fallen. "I must feed soon," he muttered. He glanced at her. "Did you tell anyone you were coming here?" Eleanor's stomach nodded. He needed to feed. He needed blood. She could feel her pulse pounding against her temples. She had told no one. He could kill her, and no one would know. But this was Trevor. Surely he would not harm her. Quietly, he crossed the room, his gaze holding hers. "Did you tell anyone?" he asked in a hypnotic voice. Eleanor jumped at the sound of soft tapping on the door. "Come in," Trevor snapped impatiently. Priscilla came in dressed in a blue satin gown that perfectly matched the blue of her eyes. "I thought I heard you talking to someone," she said in a soft voice. "Eleanor, are you feeling any better today?" "A little," Eleanor admitted. "I thought you had a party to go to tonight," Trevor said. Priscilla smiled, her blue eyes glowing. "Oh, cousin, the party isn't until much later. I had hoped you'd escort me." "I can't," he told her. "You know that Eleanor's father was murdered 2 nights ago. I fear for her safety." "Eleanor is perfectly fine here," Priscilla said. "But it is sweet of you to offer to stay with her." Priscilla's gaze darted between Eleanor and Trevor. Then a knowing look crept into her eyes. "She's the one, isn't she? You're in love with her." Eleanor felt her cheeks grow warm. Trevor had told his cousin that he loved her. Trevor took a menacing step forward. "She is the one. I want no harm to come to her." "Then marry her," Priscilla said. Eleanor caught her breath. She glanced at Trevor, trying to gauge his reaction. "I don't know if she loves me," he said stiffly. Priscilla waved a hand in the air. "Oh, of course she loves you. I can tell by looking." Trevor met Eleanor's gaze. He looked uncomfortable as he said, "There are things about me." "You work too hard," Priscilla said as she crossed the room and took his arm. She smiled at Eleanor. "He spends all day in this stuffy old study working. You'll be good for him. Make him come out and play." "Priscilla," he ground out through clenched teeth. But Priscilla didn't seem to notice Trevor's rising fury. "Do you love him?" she asked Eleanor. The thought of loving Trevor frightened Eleanor more than she cared to admit. He was a creature of the night, tortured by what he was, longing for what he could never have. But she had to speak the truth. "Yes," Eleanor whispered. Priscilla beamed. "Wonderful. We are having a party here at the end of the week anyway. Now we shall dedicate the occasion to celebrating your betrothal." "Wait, this is happening all too quickly. My father was only buried yesterday, and—" "Nonsense," Priscilla said. "You've had enough grimness and grief. A party is exactly what you need to lift your spirits." Eleanor glanced across the room at Trevor. She could not tell if he was happy at the news. Her own heart was torn. She was going to marry the man she loved. A vampire.